Welcome to the Inner Space Covent Garden talk. Today, our topic is from rejection to acceptance in relationships. No one likes it, but rejection in relationships does happen. The thing is, most rejection that we experience is not personal. So why do we make it personal? Why does rejection cause so much emotional hurt and heartache? If we were to find a way to navigate from the discomfort of rejection to self-acceptance and accepting other people's choices, we can turn rejection into an opportunity for a deeper connection. So we've asked our speaker, Charlie Hogg, for strategies on how to go from rejection to acceptance and make 2025 the year we thrive in all our relationships. Since 1975, Charlie has been meditating and inspiring people globally to add spirituality to their daily life. Charlie is the national coordinator of the Brahma Kumaris in Australia, and as a senior teacher, he is responsible for international projects and administrative direction of the organization's global network of centers. Charlie's going to be sharing with us for around 40 minutes, and then he's going to lead us into a short meditation. And the idea of the meditation is to take what you've heard and allow it to sink into your heart deeply. So it becomes something that you can access and use from tomorrow. After that, he'll be taking your questions. So please send in your questions via the question and answer link or the chat, and I'll take those questions and put them to Charlie on your behalf. Charlie, thank you. Over to you.
So thank you so much, RT. So lovely to see you, and a big happy new year. In fact, I'm sitting in Sydney. It's 5:30 a.m. on Saturday morning. We are now 11 hours difference at this time of year. And if I can say, it's especially lovely for me to see RT. I began my spiritual journey in London, 50 years ago, and I knew Artie when she was this big. So even though we live on the other side of the world, there's always a lovely, lovely connection. Yeah, I would just like to share a few of my thoughts and observations. We all have a lifetime experience of acceptance and rejection, and it's so integral to a quality life, really, to move into the acceptance realm from feeling rejected. But when I look at our world, we live in an extraordinary world. 8 billion human beings, 195 or thereabouts countries, because it keeps changing, 6,500 spoken languages, and 4,500 practiced religions. When you see this extraordinary world with all the differences, all the diversity, all the rapid change, is it easy to accept it? And let's be real, I think accepting or acceptance is one of the big challenges for all of us at the moment. And yet I think life is saying that it's one of the most necessary qualities we need at this time, seeing the diversity on our planet, seeing the diversity in front of us every single day. And I would say that acceptance in one way is one of the pinnacles of the spiritual journey, to come to a sweet place in myself where I really begin to accept myself. Because really my life experience tells me when I battle with accepting others and their behaviors, it's because I still haven't fully accepted myself. And when I really begin to accept myself and not reject myself, then it's like it's a huge step forward in life. If I find myself mentally rejecting people and what they stand for and what they believe in and a lot of things, if I look deep within myself, I'll find elements of that habit with myself too. Self-rejection is unfortunately one of the great issues of the world today. You know, sometimes when I see this world and the sort of the seemingly increasing chaos and unraveling of our planet, I often think, where does it begin? Where does it begin? And I think that when there's an unhealthy relationship with myself, when there's 8 billion human beings struggling and battling to accept myself, that sort of self-rejection flows into my health, my family life, my relationships, my performance in the workplace. It flows everywhere. And to me, the most intimate aspect of life is this first relationship in life. And today, I want to also explore that as well. But let us look at rejection. I'm not a psychologist or a counselor, but in my life, I've been able to move around the world to a huge number of countries. And when you scratch the surface of almost all human beings, everyone's got stories about relationships. And I would say, in my listening, the greatest hurt is to feel rejected. And the greatest gift to give to another human being is love, belonging, inclusion, acceptance. It's sort of an energy that you have value. You have value. And that feeling when we get from people is so uplifting. But the feeling of being unloved and rejected is the most soul-destroying feeling for most human beings. We feel so vulnerable. And once I was invited to a Buddhist conference, and as you know, Buddhism is one of its main tenets is non-violence. And this conference was about non-violence, and I was speaking with a Buddhist monk. And we had a wonderful discussion, excuse me, where does really violence begin? What is the seed of violence? And we talked about this and we came to the conclusion, the seed of violence, look how violent our world is at the moment, is a rejection, is a violence against the self. When I reject the self, I'm violent against the self. I put myself down, I criticize myself, I defame myself, I tell myself I'm hopeless. Like that internal violence is the seed of our violent world, which we see around us. And I even remember once I was involved in a retreat in Melbourne. The Brahma Kumaris have 2 beautiful retreat centers in Melbourne. And we had a group of people, and it was a discussion around healing relationships. And this whole group of people came to the conclusion also that the most challenging thing in human relationships is to feel rejected. The human spirit needs to belong. It's a part of our psyche. And when I feel someone completely rejects me, it's not just rejection, it's like it goes to the core of my being. And because we lack self-respect, it can have a massive detrimental effect on my mental, emotional, and spiritual health. But in my experience, there's sort of layers of rejection. There's, the rejection where I don't speak to somebody. I give them the silent treatment, that sort of attitude towards people. Or, I I belittle somebody, make them really consciously defame them, put them down, belittle them. That's like a gross form of rejection. A more subtle form of rejection, I just show disrespect. I never show respect. When that person comes in front of me in my vision, or my whole response is, I don't respect you. You're not valuable to me. We have all had that feeling at some point of time. Or even I chronically disagree with whatever that person says. Whatever that person expresses, I chronically put it down. But even there's more refined way of rejection, which is I don't include. It's very subtle. I just don't include you. I don't acknowledge your presence. So there's so many layers of rejection that all of us feel. And because the culture of the world is lack of self-respect, this can have such an impact, even in just a millisecond, just a facial expression. One word can sort of trigger the habit of feeling unloved and rejected. And I feel then that's the trigger for so much misinterpretation of people and motives and situations. So this habit to be rejected is really profound. And sometimes I think the culture of our world today is rejection. The culture is, I accept you, I reject you, I like you, I dislike you. This is an incredibly powerful culture. And I remember some years ago reading that book. It's nearly 30 years ago, I think, The Clash of Civilizations, where a Harvard professor began to write about how in the contemporary world we all live together from all backgrounds. And he identified a number of cultures in the world, the main cultures, the Western culture, the Confucian culture, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Hindu, the Islamic, the sort of Slavic Orthodox, the African, the Latin American, etc., all the different cultures. And what he observed is that all cultures have a set of values and principles that we're brought up with. It's almost like an unknowing absorption. Culture is embedded in my psyche, and it's how I perceive life when I look through the filter of my culture. And often when I look at the other through the filter of my culture, they seem uneducated and uncivilized. So I developed this air of superiority. And he felt that so many of the problems of the world were that we all carry the ego of our culture and this subliminal message that our culture is better. Whether it's Western, whether it's Confucian, Japanese, Hindu, Islamic, we have this sense of superiority. And this means that there's a lot of discrimination, and it's a form of rejection that all of us have felt in our lives in different ways. There's sort of being discriminated just by the labels of my temporary self, my body. I've been to 3 countries in the world where I wasn't allowed into places of worship just because of what I looked like. I wasn't even allowed in the door. I went to one place of worship and they said, "Are you this religion?" I said, "No." And said, "You can't come in." I said, "But if I come in and I learn, I might become one." Still, they would not let me. Anyway, it is the nature of the world in which we live, this culture of rejection. And I often sort of think of the isms of this world. I call them the scourge of our world, which is, racism, sexism, ageism, nationalism, and I call it religionism. I've made up that word. These isms that we identify with, and all they do is I identify with my set of labels and I may reject your set of labels. This is the culture all of us have been living with. But in a way, relationships on one-to-one, even goes deeper than this sort of rejection based on the labels of my body. And over the years, I think my whole idea of acceptance has really begun to change, because I used to sort of think acceptance was more forcing myself. I have to tolerate, I have to like. And even sometimes, when there's inappropriate behavior, oh, I should accept. But actually, I've begun to think that acceptance is letting go all forms of resistance. It's like letting go this mindset of againstness. That mindset that rejects. And this mindset, I often feel that we meet somebody, we connect with somebody. It may be a long-term relationship or short-term. And as soon as they begin to express and speak and verbalize, we start to respond. And if I don't really like their opinions or their attitude or their behavior or whatever it may be, I start to build this wall of resistance in my mind. That's how I sort of sometimes think it. You're standing in front of somebody, you may not say much, but in your mind, you start to disapprove, dislike, object, reject. All this is going on in my mind with the other because they represent things, or they're saying things, or they're expressing things which are creating discomfort in me. And that energy of my mind, I often feel that we're so naive about the power of our mind. We sort of think it's private. It's not private at all. Sometimes I think the mind is like a huge billboard on a street that everyone can see. People feel your mind. Your mind is like a perfume. And when it's sweet, people will accept you and love you and come close to you. But when I'm, producing the energy, and it's an energy, a tangible vibe or energy of disapproval, dislike, objection, rejection, all these feeling threatened, all these sorts of energies that start to go around my mind, just automatically the other feels rejected. The other doesn't come close to me. Some people wonder why others don't come close to me. It's the feelings I create in my mind. And sometimes these thoughts of disapproval and dislike, actually make my heart grow distant from others. Most of us, the most important thing in life is for my heart to feel close. One of the beauties of life is when I absolutely feel love and belonging with another individual. And the great hurt of life is when I feel rejected, disapproved of, disliked by the other. And why do I resist? Why do I reject? I've thought about this a lot, because in my personal journey, I really don't want to reject anybody. And yet sometimes I find that habit, it's so instant, it just kicks in. These thoughts of dislike, these thoughts of disapproval, these thoughts that this is not right, this is not good. And then I give that energy to others. And I began to see that I often hold an expectation of how you should be, of how things should be. I have a sort of an expectation that people should behave in a certain way. People should speak in a certain way. People should respond in a certain way. And if you don't do that, then I start to build up that energy in my mind of rejection. It's like an attachment to how things should be. And it's a really interesting thing, because the reality is you behave in that way and that's who you are. But I just cannot ever accept that that's who you are. And I keep projecting onto you that you should be something different. And this is something I think really, really profoundly deep. That, how easy is it to reject? How natural is it to reject? It's almost instant. Why? Because I I react to the reality of who you are as a person. And yeah, I think it's incredibly, incredibly deep. Why don't I accept you as you are? Why am I projecting onto you that you have to be something to fulfill my desires, to fulfill how I think you should be? And I really began to work through this. And once I was with somebody here that I found often when I was with that person, those feelings of disapproval, dislike, judgment came up in me. And it was a regular thing. And you know, when those feelings do come up, they're negative feelings and your own state of mind drops. You don't feel good and you don't feel good about who you are. It's a natural consequence of that attitude towards somebody. And I was observing, you know, why do I have resistance to this person? Why do I find it so hard to accept them? And I began to see how I was holding on to this position. I was attached to a position of how this person should behave and how she should speak. And, you know, I was projecting onto her. And honestly, I can say I just saw it so clearly. I let it go. I could not believe how light I felt, how a lot of that resistance creates an energy of stress and tension and that, you know, we all know that sort of sense of internal discomfort. When my mind is under the influence of the energy of rejection, disapproval, and dislike, I literally let it go. And I just relaxed. And it was almost like I just felt I was observing that person rather than absorbing. Archie and I were talking a little bit about this at the beginning, because that was something I began to practice, that when I sort of allow myself to come under the influence of another person's behavior, I absorb their energy and then I react to it and I come under influence and negativity, don't really like who I am. And in a way, I began to observe, it almost naturally happened. And now, honestly, if I see my mind starting to build up that wall of resistance or rejection to another, you know, almost instantly I remind myself, let it go. Let it go. Of course, it takes practice. Of course, it takes practice, but it's absolutely possible. And, you know, I think this feeling which we have inside of rejecting others has a huge detrimental effect on the quality of my life. And it's like rejection is saying no to life. Acceptance is saying like yes to life. Because every time I allow that energy to kick in, those vibrations to kick in, those feelings to flow, that perfume, that smelly perfume to penetrate the atmosphere, it's like a block to my relationships. People will feel it instantly and they'll become distant from me. And I often put it on them, but actually it's my reaction to them, which is really creating the problem for me. But you know, the real effect I've observed is when I'm a rejecter, when I reject people. It's incredible, really, when you think about it. The biggest hurt for us is to feel rejected, unloved, not belonging, and yet we do it to others. Often we're so blind to the way we reject others. And when I am feeling I'm rejected by you, I feel so deeply hurt and can have such a negative feeling to you, but often don't identify how I'm a rejecter myself. But the real effect is on the relationship with myself, because this is the first relationship in life. To me, this is all the heart and soul of spirituality, is rebuilding an unhealthy relationship that I have with myself. And one of the main reasons it's unhealthy is this habit of rejecting others. And when I reject others, deep down, I don't like who I am. The effect, my observation, if we observe that when I pay out on somebody, I reject somebody, may even not be verbal, it's just mentally, I dislike them, I give them the silent treatment, whatever I do, deep down, it damages my relationship with me. I know I can be better. I know I can be better. And this is why I'd say one of the ways of describing the spiritual journey is moving from rejection to acceptance, or being a resistor to an observer, or a rejecter to an acceptor and an observer. And I, I think this is an amazing journey that we start, and it's one of the ways of describing the spiritual journey. And for me, one aspect of this, maybe the first step, is to begin to accept what is. And that really means to become a detached observer. You know, life is, and at the moment, a lot of things are happening in the world. And it's not accepting them by meaning I'm approving of them, but it's the reality I'm faced with. I can't change those things. All I can do is change my reaction to those things. If I keep reacting and rejecting, then what happens to my state of mind? And so I need to learn how to begin to become the observer. And the observer is still aware, still involved, still responsible, still connecting, but I'm not absorbing all the stuff of people and situations and opinions. And it's a great state of wisdom, I would say. And this is like the first step, I think, of acceptance to what is. And for that, for me, it's like beginning to really accept, you know, or know who I am. And my observation is that in me, there's three personalities. Two of them reject, and one of them begins the journey to fully accepting and moving into that sweet space. And the first personality I call the I of arrogance, or the I of superiority. This is the first rejecter. And when this personality is ruling my inner world, it's like, who am I? I see myself as all these temporary labels of my body, my gender, my, my nationality, all those temporary labels. That's my sense of self. Excuse my throat, I'm very sorry. And when this I is ruling my inner world, I compare with others. And I sort of think it's subconscious in a way. I'm better. I know more. I am right. My perception of reality is right. But when it comes into my feelings, I feel so easily insulted, disrespected, not valued, excluded, sensitive. You know, in a way, I feel so easily rejected, and I so easily reject. It's my ego who rejects. It's my ego that really rejects others, I would say. And there's an incredibly deep relationship between ego and love and belonging and acceptance. In a sense, the more ego, the more I reject. And the more I reject, the less I feel love and belonging in my life. What is the role of ego? Ego makes you feel separate. Ego tells you you're not really good. I feel separate from others. I feel separate from my true self. I feel completely like disconnected in the world. And so when I am when I don't know who I am, and I think I'm just a temporary body, the first child of that is my ego. The ego is the big rejecter of others. But the second I is the powerful I in the world today, I believe. It's also a rejecter. And I call it the eye of inferiority or the eye of lack of self-respect. And this eye also takes this whole sense of self from all the labels of my body. And when this eye is ruling, I compare with others, but I think others are better. Others know more. Others don't love me. Others don't respect me. Others don't value me. You know, it's like a mantra inside my head. It's almost like when I feel that, I reject myself. When it comes into my feelings, I feel hopeless, inadequate, inferior, and I would say depressed. You know, in psychology, depression is like a sadness that the dream in my life, you know, to be loved and valued hasn't happened. But in spirituality, depression is like a sadness, you know, or a mourning for the loss of my true identity. I'm living my life, but who am I really? So for most of us, when this eye of lack of self-respect is there, I keep rejecting the self. Look, you're a failure. Look, you're hopeless. We talk down to the self. The self-talk is so negative and so critical. And so these two eyes are dominating my life, the ego rejecting others and the lack of self-respect, the ego of inferiority rejecting the self. And most of us are in this game of up and down of my ego of superiority and my ego of inferiority. And this is why this journey to acceptance begins with accepting my permanent self, my true self, my real self. And that is the soul. The soul is a wonder. The soul is just a point. You know, someone told me recently that in science, they now believe this body is made up of 30 trillion cells. I have no idea how they count that. 30 trillion, that's unimaginable. The soul is more subtle than one cell. I am a soul. I'm a non-physical entity. And as I begin to reconnect with my true self, my permanent self, almost automatically, the door of acceptance begins to open. Because as I begin to know myself and as I begin to accept myself, I'm on the journey to accepting others. And I would say this most profound step of healing the relationship with self, opening the relationship with myself as a soul, is integral for this journey of acceptance. The soul is just a point. It exists, but it has no length, breadth, or width. I am an immortal, eternal point of conscious energy. It's a wonder. I've lived before this body, and I will live after this body. You know, when I start to accept myself based on my bodily attributes, I'll go through that up and down, sometimes good, sometimes not good. But actually, as I begin to rebuild my relationship with myself as a soul, the healing really begins deeply. And sometimes I see my inner world like a tree. A tree has a seed, a trunk, branches, and leaves. Your thoughts are the leaves. So often the thoughts are all running, acceptance, rejection, like, dislike. The speed of thinking is so great. But what's feeding the leaves? It's the branches. And these are my mental and emotional habits that I've collected along the way. Sometimes I'm perfectionist, sometimes I'm paranoid, whatever. But what feeds the branches is the trunk, the subconscious. And Freud said that 80 to 90% of our behaviors come out of my subconscious. But what feeds the trunk is the seed. It's my sense of self. When the sense of self is false, it's a falsehood that I'm a temporary body. It pollutes the trunk, it pollutes the branches. And on the top, overthinking. And often we try to cherry pick out the unpleasant thoughts of rejection and dislike. But because I haven't changed the seed, they just keep coming back in different forms. When I change the seed, I start to go about my life really identifying that I am this eternal soul. And I found it so easy to accept myself. As I really began to understand myself as a soul, the journey to acceptance really begins. And when you sow that seed, it influences the trunk, the branches, and really the thoughts on the top are much calmer, much cooler, and much easier. So I begin to accept what is. And then I begin to accept others. And to me, that's really becoming a benevolent observer. Maybe you think I'm very idealistic, but I feel really it's so important to really have good wishes and I would say pure feelings of others. Because the more I generate negative feelings, they just bring me down completely. And to me, it's almost like a decision in life. Every human being I meet has qualities and attributes and weaknesses. The more I see my own weaknesses, I tune into their weaknesses. That's the reality. So we play this game of acceptance, rejection. But the more I tune into their goodness, they will more likely begin to tune into my goodness too. And one of the ways that I've tried to move in that direction is to go deeper into the self, deeper into who am I. And what I mean by that is that the soul is an overname for three aspects of consciousness. The mind, which is the vessel where I think and feel. So the mind receives information from the sense organs. So what I see, what I hear, what I taste, what I feel is thrown up on the screen of the mind. The intellect assesses all that data. The intellect is constantly trying to make sense of that data. The intellect makes a decision, we do an action. And then the subconscious is a record of every decision and action I've made. It's incredible. All of us are sitting here listening to this webinar, and we all carry an entire database of our past. When I begin to understand that, what I've often felt in relationships, that relationships are a little bit like icebergs, not that they're cold, but an iceberg is 10% above the water, 90% below. We meet somebody, we see them physically, we're attracted, or we develop an impression. Sometimes there's immense attraction to what I see physically. But as I get to know the person as time goes by, the 90% below the surface, the subconscious story begins to emerge, and we begin to reject, dislike, disapprove. And sometimes we get in this cycle of being attracted, and then as I get to know, starting to dislike, disapprove. And that cycle of relationships, attraction to rejection, is such a painful thing. And I begin to think maybe I'm a failure in relationships. And this is where, when I have a spiritual vision, I start to see that everyone is carrying their story in their subconscious. And I would say everyone is under the influence of that at the moment. We can be very judgmental. It's human nature. Or I can stand back a bit as that benevolent observer and have a bit of mercy that we're all struggling at the moment. My view is everyone, no matter how good we look on the surface, we're battling with our stuff inside. It's not easy. And often I'm rejecting myself, and then it flows into rejecting you, and I just make life much worse. So when I begin to understand much more depth about each soul, each one is a soul, each one is carrying their story, each one is under the influence of their story. So if I can offer them sort of love, respect, compassion, and mercy, it has a massive influence. And just finally, acceptance of self is just really, I would say, the highest point in the spiritual journey. I think almost all of us begin this journey struggling and battling in this relationship with the self, really. And I began to realize when I started, I had these deep beliefs about myself, that I'm not good enough, that I'm inferior, that others won't love me. And these beliefs are so strong. And It's almost like the spiritual journey is beginning to break down these hardened beliefs I've developed about myself, because they're not the truth. The original state of the self is to be loving, is to be peaceful, is to be merciful, is to be kind. That's my original programming. As I forgot myself and only identified with my temporary labels, my ego of superiority and ego of inferiority have kicked in. So they reject others, reject the self. The more I go back into that self-awareness and really experience that love, and I know I should be winding up. So, and really, I would say one of the main ways I've felt I've been able to begin this journey and move more and more from rejection to acceptance is my relationship with the divine. And I don't see myself as religious, but I have a natural lover of the soul. And I just see the divine or God as a soul like me, but a pure soul. A soul that's never been caught up in this taking a human form, taking birth and rebirth, knowing the game of acceptance and rejection. It's not just imagination, it's not just a belief, it's a real living relationship with a real soul. And in a way, when I meditate, I just allow myself to taste that love. And the more I feel loved, the more I can give it to others. A natural flow on when I taste this love is I'll pass it on to others. So thank you for your patience listening to this ramble. But now I'd really like to invite us just for a few moments of meditation. Let me sit quietly. Just feel yourself relaxing, calming down. And let me just observe the first relationship of life, the one with me. How do I treat myself? Am I loving? Am I kind? Am I compassionate? Am I merciful? Or do I reject the self, criticize the self, put the self down? This is at the heart of the spiritual journey. To begin to heal this relationship with who I am. To begin this journey to acceptance. Let me begin with self-acceptance. Visualize myself as the eternal soul. A tiny spark of life energy residing in the front of the brain, in the center of the forehead. I am a peaceful soul. This is my permanent self, my true self. My original state is completely peaceful and lovable. But over time, as I forgot myself and only identified with my bodily image, my temporary image, my ego and lack of self-respect began to dominate my inner world. And with this, the game of accepting some and rejecting some began. But now I'm on the healing journey. And it begins with accepting who I am. My original blueprint in my subconscious is positive. It is benevolent. But in time, I became conditioned, and negativity began to dominate my inner world. And I even began to identify that this is me. But now I realize it's not me. It's the conditioned me. The real me is that peaceful, loving soul. If I begin to go about my life living in a soul-conscious state, gently, gently, step by step, I begin to like who I am, accept who I am. And the more I do this, I again begin to accept others also. Spirituality is practicing every day. Just having gentle attention on my own attitude. The more I practice, the more I can step into the person I really want to be. Seeing our world, it becomes more and more important to do this work. To keep this gentle attention towards who I really am, accepting the self. And as I begin to accept others, even though they are battling in their lives, I can make a difference in this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie, for sharing your insights and taking us through that experience. You've left us with many things to think about, but also many tools. So thank you very much. There's lots of questions that have come in, so let me begin with the first ones. How can we manage the emotions and feelings caused by rejections from others? And within that, how to deal with the feelings of rejection that are rooted in childhood experiences, for example, bullying, that have formed patterns in our psyche.
Thank you, Auntie Ben. The first thing is to acknowledge it's not easy. But the real way to deal is not to project on the person. The person is really instrumental in my journey. And if I try to, change that person, it's never going to work, as we all know. It's actually, a lot of it is dealing with my own internal world. And that is with my own ego. It's my ego that is accepting this sorrow. And For some years ago, I had this little saying for myself, only my ego accepts sorrow. If I'm feeling really hurt, disrespected, not valued, it's the false self that is accepting this. Because it may sound a bit idealistic, perhaps, but the more I practice the reality of who I am, the less that addiction, and I call it an addiction of feeling rejected, taking sorrow, because my ego of lack of self-respect is so powerful today. One little indication, I just take so much hurt. Sometimes even people have no intention to hurt me, and yet I take hurt from it. In saying that, because it's profoundly deep, because it's a lifelong experience, it takes time. But I find that if one, I really practice who I am, the habit gets less and less. It doesn't change overnight. And probably the main thing to heal deeply abuse, bullying, disrespect, rejection is to feel the love of the divine. And what I do every single morning of my life, I sit quietly and I just let go the consciousness of my body. And I just feel I'm sitting so lightly in the void. I, the eternal soul, to the point you almost can feel, you understand what death is, that the soul just departs from this costume. And in that state, I sit in front of the lover of the soul, the supreme soul, an unlimited source of love. I'm not just meditating on a belief or a concept. I'm directly connecting with a real being. And just like all of us listening, as I've been talking, people have popped in your head. Why? They think of you. They may be in Australia, you're in the UK, or wherever you are. And yet a thought is instant. You pick it up. And so your thoughts are an energy of communication. In the same way, when I meditate, I'm in direct connection with the Supreme Soul, unlimited source of love. And the more I feel loved, so much of the pain and sorrow of our relationships in families, the feelings of rejection, begin to be resolved. It doesn't, as I say, resolve overnight, but the healing process begins. And I would experiment with that, just sitting in the early morning, becoming the seed, the point, sitting like a little child in front of the divine and allowing myself to be loved. And if I can't feel that love, keep persevering. Because there's this deep habit, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough to be loved. This is the power of my lack of self-respect. But as I break through that and just even a little ray of love comes in, the healing process begins and the habit of rejecting and feeling rejected starts to change.
Thank you. The next couple of questions I'm going to group for you because they're about narcissistic tendencies in relationships. And the first person is asking about a mother who has such tendencies and is involved in gaslighting with the rest of the family. But there's still the concern for the mother who's getting older, and the relationship is in tatters, and it gives the person a lot of sorrow. At some point in the future, she would like to take care of her mother, but can't see how this is possible. Do you have any thoughts where to start with this? And the other person is asking about where there's been a rejection from a narcissist partner that they love and that they used to love and they still love. How do they move forward?
I think the mother is my mother. How crucial is there any relationship in life which is in a sense, more important. And my partner is my partner, my life partner. But if we sort of take an objective or stand back and view that my mother is a soul, my partner is a soul, I'm a soul, we're all carrying our stories. And our stories has sort of really polluted my perception of reality. And unfortunately, some or so many, if not the majority of us, just feel an absolute victim in life, a total victim of people and families and behaviors and then this narcissistic behavior of people who are sort of can't even understand the other. They're just so absorbed in really themselves because they feel so lacking in self-respect. The seed of that narcissism is a self-dislike, a lack of self-respect, almost, and I sort of build this other personality that is so needy. Life is really about me and what I need. And it's the end point of, shall we say, a lack of self-awareness or body consciousness. You know, it's all about me changing my response because we know the law of life says I cannot change them. They are who they are. And if I want to repair the relationship, I have to repair my response. And if I want to repair my response to them, I've got to step back into my own self-respect by practicing who I am. And really, this is the only method. It's the more I strengthen myself, I'm not so influenced by, the mother or the partner. This is the spiritual journey. The spiritual journey, the first law says, I am responsible for how I feel. People will be rude, people will be difficult, people will be narcissistic. They will be everything in this world. But if I allow it to absorb me, that's actually my decision. And if I'm that honest with myself that, yes, it's true, the behavior is very inappropriate sometimes. But if I really want a relationship with them, I've got to I can't change them. I've got to educate myself not to be so under the influence of their behavior. This is what the spiritual journey is. The more I go back into my self-respect, the less I will be influenced by those around me. I can have that sort of observer state where I don't absorb their behavior, and then I can really help them. The less I'm influenced by them, the more I can actually help them. And we all love to give and to help and support. So in saying all that, it is not easy at this time. I feel we're at a time where all human souls have lost their power. So all these strange behaviors are absolutely everywhere in families and workplaces. So I can't change that, but what I can change is my response. This is the spiritual journey. And this is why it's so important to put proper time into really caring for myself, healing myself, accepting myself. And the more I will have the capacity to really accept others in relationships.
There are so many questions, but I am very aware that you need to be running another session shortly. So we will tie up, and I'm very sorry we haven't managed to ask all the questions, but thank you for sharing your thoughts this evening.
Archie, can I make a suggestion? I'm happy to come back sometime. Maybe could we just have a question and answer, just the whole session, just chit chat? Because often that's gets to the essence of situations. Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to do that if that works for you.
Oh, that's brilliant. That is absolutely brilliant. April, I think you'll be back home in April.
Hopefully.
Yeah,
I will be. I
imagine.
will be.
I know February is meetings and March, I'm sure you're full on already. So if I can, I'll send you some dates for April, and then we can take all those questions that we haven't been able to ask, but even more. So thank you. Yes, we will take you up on that. Thank you.